The Victory Garden, Chapter 3. The war news was better now. In the spring of 1943, according to the newsreels, the Allies were calling the shots, but we sure hadn't won yet. I knew in my heart that Jeff was safe. Pilots were up above the fighting, weren't they? It was just that he was gone. I tried to be happy because he was flying and that's what he'd always wanted to do. I try not to be happy that he wasn't a Marine. That didn't seem right. Not when I thought about Wake Island out in the Pacific and our Marines who had been in a brutal defeat there. Jeff would be back someday. Sonny Ferguson, the judge's son, would never come home again. But I wasn't thinking about Sonny Ferguson or even about the war when the jangle of the telephone broke in on our Sunday breakfast. I was thinking about the lace on my new dress. Mother had spent extra money on the lace and extra time to sew it on. I ate in my bathrobe, all dressed except for the blue watered taffeta that would be my good dress until I outgrew it. On Sunday morning, Mother said when the telephone rang. I was closest to it. I heard the shaking in Mrs. Bert's voice. Teresa? Please, can your daddy come quickly? Mr. Bert's been badly hurt. Yes, I dropped the receiver and echoed her words. The next part was a blur. Sirens squealing, neighbors spilling into the street. The doctor saying, stand back, stand back. The men carried him out, big Tom Burt, a helpless giant, on a canvas stretcher. The ambulance sped away for the nearest hospital, 50 miles east. I glimpsed Mrs. Burt sitting in the back, a tiny figure squeezed in on a stool beside the stretcher. I wanted to take back all the bad stuff I had thought about Mr. Burt. It was too late for church. Neighbors milled about, then drifted in shock back to their homes. We better close up their house, said Dad. We shut the windows, pulled down the shades, and turned off the stove burner under the coffee pot, then walked back across the street in silence. Old Wolf whimpering beside us. We sat on our porch, me in my bathrobe, Mother and Dad still dressed for church, staring across at the empty house. Mr. Burt was out visiting his old farm, Mother said. The tractor turned over on him. Lucas, the hired man, brought him in. Like many older townfolk, the Burts had rented their country land to younger farmers, then retired from the grinding work of putting in crops year after year. Lucas had stayed on, working for the new tenants. Mr. Burt took to town life with all the willingness of a plow mule, Dad said, smiling at some memory. He spends enough time in his garden to bring in 60 acres of wheat. Says a man isn't made for sitting around the house. I guess that's what kept drawing him back to the country, said Mother. He just had to be back in the fields now and then. I looked across at Mr. Burt's garden and wondered if Dad was thinking the same thing I was. The sun crept behind the mulberry tree before we started Sunday dinner. We said little as we ate. The chicken my mother had killed and dressed on Saturday. I had plucked out the last stubborn pin feathers myself, was fried to a golden crispness, but it felt strange in my mouth. Even the meat of the wishbone, which I no longer had to fight Jeff for, tasted dry. I'll have him more comfortable by now, Dad said. They'll have him more comfortable by now, Dad said. I know, I said, guilty that my thoughts were not with Mr. Burt. I was thinking of his wife. Gas rationing would not allow her to travel back and forth while Mr. Burt lay in the hospital. She would stay with friends in the city. It would be a long stay, I feared. I missed her already. I could still see her in the ambulance as it pulled away. How could the man and his wife be so different? I wondered. One look from Tom Burt could scare the socks off you. Yet I'd had wonderful hours with Mrs. Burt among her flowers. In winter, when there were no flowers to pick, we sat in her kitchen with steaming cups of hot chocolate, talking and watching snowflakes gather at the window. I had promised to feed and walk Old Wolf until the Burt's relatives could come from Morris County to take him to their farm. We'd already locked up their house. That took care of everything but the garden. I can water the flowers after school, I said as we cleared the dishes. School's out soon anyway. I cannot imagine taking care of Mr. Burt's enormous vegetable garden. Even so, I was stunned when Dad said, "I'll call Lucas to come and plow it under." "Daddy, you can't do that," I blurted out, even though he was talking to Mother. "It's the way Mr. Burt wants it, Teresa." I forgot that I had once hated the thought of gardening and that I didn't exactly love Old Man Burt. "But that garden is his reason for being," I exclaimed. Mrs. Burt had told me that in those very words. Dad looked up, surprised but firm. "Tom's a proud man. He doesn't want to come home and see his garden dried up." "Ellen, couldn't we take care of it?" my mother asked. "I don't see how," he said. "We're stretched thin as it is, without help at the store." I knew he was right. The war had drawn workers away from small towns, to the army, to farms and to factories in the cities. Dad worked long hours at our store, Mark's Bouterie there. Dad worked long hours at our store, Mark's Bouterie. There were more old shoes to fix than new ones to sell during these war days, and his repairman had left for the airplane factory. Mother worked there too, while I was in school, and brought bookkeeping home at night. It was the same for everybody in town. "What about Lucas?" I asked. "Lucas has his hands full out at the farm." "Dad," I began. He held up a hand. "Tom Burt has planted that whole empty lot next to his house. We can never do it justice." "But you can't just destroy it." "Teresa, Mr. Burt is a farmer. Farmers plow things under sometimes. When they do, the plants nourish the soil for the next crop." I frowned. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I said, 'I'll take care of it, Tom Burt. You just get well.'" I turned my head and risked a smile. He hadn't actually said we would plow it under. Upstairs, I brushed my hair 100 strokes and pulled on my pajamas. I wish I could talk to Jeff about the garden. It wasn't just Mr. Burt's reason for being, it was his reason for challenging Dad. I knew by now that he did it to help Dad bear the time without Jeff. I'd watched Dad a lot. When he dug his hands into the soil or smoothed the dirt over a weeded place, he had a peaceful look about him. I think he felt close to Jeff in the garden. I did, with the sky there above us. Even if miles and miles away, Jeff was in that same sky flying his B-24. I mumbled a short version of my prayers, skipping the kneeling part but not skipping "God bless Jeff." And of course, my folks and the birds, and curled around my pillow. I don't remember the words, but I think I asked how we could save the Burt's garden. By morning, I had the answer, but I would need a lot of help.